Okay, today what we're going to do is we are going to demonstrate what a tax looks like on the basic supply and demand model. There's two different graphs that you might see. One is a tax on the sellers, one is a tax on the buyers. Tax on the sellers is going to look like it's shifting the supply curve to the left, or a decrease in supply. With the tax on buyers, it's going to appear to decrease the demand for the particular product that we are taxing. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways and maybe explain some alternatives and some tricks to doing the graphing correctly. So we're going to start with the soda graph. So let's assume that there is a market for soda and there's a 20-cent tax placed on soda. So what we're going to have is, we have original consumer and producer surplus, equilibrium quantities at 500, equilibrium prices at $1. Let us suppose that the government puts a 20-cent tax per unit on soda cans. Well, what this is going to do is it's going to appear to move the demand curve to the left, or it's going to actually look like it's going down at every point in the amount of 20 cents. And so what we can do is just draw a new demand curve in the amount of 20 cents. So notice I'm just dropping each point by about 20 cents. Now, once I do that, it's going to be a little bit more confusing to draw the tax box. So I'm actually going to recommend that you can go ahead and put these points on, and that could be helpful for you to do first, but it might be more helpful for you to draw the tax wedge, right? So look for a gap of supply and demand, between supply and demand, of 20 cents. So what I mean by that is, where is, between the original supply and demand curve, there a gap of 20 cents, and at what quantity? And we find that that gap is at the quantity of 400, approximately. So there's a 20-cent gap at 400. And then just draw what we call the tax wedge. Now this is not so much a technical term as a trick to just centering yourself on the graph. So once you draw that tax wedge in, you can go ahead and fill in your demand curve. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in my demand curve. This is going to be the new demand curve. A little crooked, but that's okay. So it's a decrease in the demand. My new equilibrium point is going to be here, because that's where supply and demand meet. My new quantity is going to be at 400, quantity 2, marker's dying. And my new price is going to be at 90, so we'll call that P2. So that's 90 cents. Now, of course, this price does not include the tax. So what I mean by that is the price went down because there's a decrease in the demand because of the tax, but when the buyer goes to the store, this may be the retail price, so to speak, but then the buyer is going to have to pay the tax above and beyond the 90 cents. So this may be the price, but then they're going to have to pay 20 cents to the government, right? Now, in most instances, we're just paying the retailer the extra, but on the graph, this is the way it's going to look. So when you add the tax in, this is what the seller is going to get, right? The seller is going to keep, they're going to get that 90 cents. But the buyer is going to end up paying 90 cents plus 20 cents in tax. So we could think of this as the buyer's cost, the buyer's price. Sometimes people will write that on there. And different textbooks will explain this in slightly different ways. This is the way that I find to be the most helpful. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to box off the buyer and the seller's cost, right? So at the top, you have what the buyers are going to end up paying at the end of the day. And at the bottom, you have what the seller is going to end up getting, right? And so for the buyers, they're going to end up paying an additional 10 cents. That's the incidence on the buyer, or the burden of the tax on the buyer. And for the sellers, they're going to get not $1 anymore, but only 90 cents. So that's the incidence on the sellers. Okay, so the sellers are going to have a reduced amount of revenue in the amount of 10 cents. So they're actually sharing what we call the tax incidence, or the tax burden, equally. Even though you put the tax on the buyers, they're actually sharing in the tax burden because of the lost revenue to the sellers and the increased cost to the buyers. That's tax incidence. So now what I'd like to do is point out a couple of other things. Note that my new quantity is 400, and that means that everything to the right gets cut off. So you might think of this as the actual market, and this is going to be the potential. Meaning that there's buyers and sellers that are over here willing to buy and sell, but because of the tax that's pushed the demand artificially to the left, what we have is buyers and sellers that are not willing to transact because of the tax, or there's a distortion. There's a manipulation of this market. So that means that everything to the right gets cut off. So this area here is going to become deadweight loss. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to use letters here. Area A, area B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, this is all part of D. What we find here, okay, a couple of things real quick, is this whole area, B and D, becomes the area of the tax. Okay, so this box here becomes the tax revenue. So the total tax revenue is going to be the area of that box, which is going to be 20 cents times 400, which I believe is 80. So the 20 cents per can times, so we're at 20 cents times 400, it's going to be equal to $80 in tax revenue. And it's also areas B and D. Now originally our consumer surplus was area A, B, and C, and our producer surplus was area D, E, and F. But because B and D go to the government, and then once again C and E become deadweight loss, so that's our deadweight loss here, C plus E. What's left of the consumer surplus? All that we have left of the consumer surplus is this area on top, which is area A. For the producer surplus, all that you have left is the area on the bottom, which is area F. Okay, now one thing that's interesting about this particular graph is that, regardless of who you tax, let's suppose that instead of taxing the buyers, you say, well, I want to tax the sellers. Basically the same thing would occur, only a couple of slight changes. Instead of shifting the demand curve, you would shift the supply curve, and then your new equilibrium point would not be here, but here. So the new retail price would have been $1.10, but that would have included tax. But then the buyer would pay $1.10 to the seller, and then the seller would have to give 20 cents to the government. It wouldn't really make a difference. In reality, this is sort of graph world more so than real life, because we don't really do taxes that way. More often than not, the sellers are actually collecting the tax on behalf of the government. But let's suppose that they weren't. You had to pay the tax separately. Then this sort of distorting effect of pushing the price down, and then the buyer would pay the tax separately to the government, as they do in this case. So the buyer is going to pay 90 cents to the seller, then they're going to pay an additional 20 cents to the government, so their total cost is going to be $1.10. Moving on to taxing sellers. When we tax sellers, what we're going to end up doing is shifting the supply curve. Now, before we go into that, notice that there's a little twist on this particular graph. And on this graph, we have a more inelastic demand curve and a more elastic supply curve. So notice that the supply curve looks flatter. Technically, that's not what elasticity is, but that's the way it appears. And notice that this is more vertical. The demand curve is more vertical, straight up and down. I for inelastic, it kind of looks like an I. That's a trick to remember. Okay, so here's the bottom line with elasticity. The more elastic something is, the less of the tax they're going to bear. Elastic, once again, means more responsive to changes in price, right? So the quantity supplied would be more responsive to changes in price. And elasticity of demand would mean that there's elastic demand would be very responsive to changes in price, or the quantity demanded is responsive to changes in price. And inelastic means they're not very responsive. Okay? So in this case, we see that the demand is very inelastic or not responsive to price. And that would make sense because this is the market for beer, and people tend to want to have beer regardless of the price, and maybe they're just less price sensitive, we should put it that way, when it comes to things like alcohol and cigarettes and things like that. Okay, so how is this going to work? What we're going to do is we are going to start off by plotting the new supply curve by lifting the supply curve upward by $4 at every point, because it's a $4 tax. So we're going to lift it at every point. That's the simplest way to plot this out. Okay, so we're lifting it by $4 at every point. That is the amount that it's shifting. We don't have to go all the way up there. Now before I do that, I'll maybe just draw this in here real lightly. But before I do that, I want to point out that this creates confusion sometimes. So when you shift the supply curve first, then you might accidentally put the tax in the wrong place. I've seen this many, many times. So what I recommend is not to draw the new supply curve first, to first find that tax wedge. It's a $4 tax wedge. So you want to insert, where is that $4 wedge going to fit? Where is there a gap between supply and demand? Okay, so we find a gap between supply and demand at the quantity of 30. So the supply curve is at the the price of 19, and the demand curve is at the price of 23. So that's a $4 gap. That is the starting point for our graph. Now, just doing this alone is good enough to tell us a lot. Right? This tells us that the tax is going to fall mostly on the consumers. Notice that the tax wedge pokes mostly into the consumer surplus and only a little bit into the consumer surplus. Okay? So that means that right away we know that the incidence is mostly on the buyers, not the sellers. Okay? So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let's fill in our supply curve here. Here's our new supply curve, so S2. And our new equilibrium point, the focal point of the graph, is going to be here. This dot is going to give us our new quantity, so we'll call it quantity 2. And it's going to give us our new price, price 2 at $23. So the price has risen not by $4, but by 3. Okay? So, knowing that the consumers are going to be paying $23 to the sellers then have to pay that $4 tax to the government, which means that the sellers are not going to get 23, they're going to get the other end of the tax wedge, which is 19. Okay? So, you might want to put here, the seller gets 19. So sellers keep 19. Maybe one way to put it. Some textbooks will say that this is your seller price. I don't really care for that language, but if that's helpful for you, you can write that. But then you want to note that this is what the buyers are going to pay. Okay, so that's their total cost. They're going to end up paying this $23, what you might think of as a retail price. Let's go ahead and finish in our tax box here. So this tax box is going to show us, this whole area is going to be the amount of tax revenue. So that tax revenue is going to be $23 to $19, so that's a $4 height, and it's going to be $30 in terms of its base or its width. So to get the tax revenue, we do the base times the height. So that's going to be $4 times 30 units, because our new quantity is at 30, it's going to give us $120. Now, that's going to be these areas. I'm actually going to go ahead and put some letters in here. So we've got area A, area B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, so our original consumer surplus was area A, B, and C. Our original producer surplus was D, E, and F. So B and D, once again, become the area of tax revenue. Okay, so that's that area. Now area B comes out of the consumer surplus. Area D comes out of the producer surplus. So that becomes the incidence on the buyers, meaning that the buyers end up paying an additional $3, right? They used to pay 20, now they're paying 23. And the sellers used to get 20, but now they're only getting 19. So area D is the incidence or the burden on the sellers. And we can clearly see that in this case, the buyers are going to pay more tax. And the sellers pay less. Or at least they have less of the burden. And that's because the supply is more elastic and the demand is more inelastic. Okay, so this all has to do with elasticity, not on who you place the tax on, right? Because the tax is placed on the sellers. One of the last things that we want to do here is note our deadweight loss. Because our new quantity is at 30, everything to the right of 30 gets cut off. Okay, so this is our actual market. Okay, everything to the right of, or left of 30, that is happening. But everything to the right gets cut off. So you might think of that as potential. Those are buyers and sellers that would be willing to buy at certain prices, but they're not in the market right now based on the specific price and tax that's been implemented. Okay, that means that areas C and E are the deadweight loss. Okay, so our deadweight loss is area C plus E. So what's left of the consumer surplus? All we have left of the consumer surplus is area A. What's left of the producer surplus? Area F. Okay, that's all that's left. Now, one other thing that we may want to consider is what would happen if you, instead of taxing the sellers, if you taxed the buyers. Well, if you were to tax the buyers instead, what you would have ended up doing is, instead of shifting the supply curve, you would have simply shifted the demand curve, and then your new equilibrium point would have been down at the bottom, down here, rather than up here. So your new retail price would have been 19, but then the buyers would have had to separately pay the tax, which would be plus 4. So that means that they would have ended up still paying 23, and the sellers would have received and then kept 19. So stating all of that, it doesn't really matter who you tax. What really matters is the elasticity. And that concludes taxes on buyers and taxes on sellers.